Okay, fantastic. Hello, my name is Reverend Sharissa Simpson Rice. I am so excited and grateful to have an opportunity to be with you today so we can talk about clergy compensation guidelines, which is probably not the first thing you've been worried about thinking about today. But if you are a church in transition and you're looking to reevaluate a salary for a pastor, this is a pretty important topic, and putting together those call agreements means you get pretty close and personal with our clergy compensation guidelines. So let's take a look at 2024's clergy compensation guidelines, and we'll start with me sharing my screen. All right. What we're going to do first is take a look and to figure out how would I even find it. So we are on the Central Atlantic website, Central Atlantic Conference's website. That is www.cacucc.org. And you'll see our picture, and we're going to scoot all the way down to the bottom of this website. Pardon me. Until we get to the very bottom, and you'll see there is search and call here. And that's what we're going to click on. And then once we get on search and call, you'll notice there's a lot of different ways for you to get information. If you're a minister in search, you have your own little spot to look at. Notes for a supply pastor, notes for the intentional interim, process, the transfer of standing process if you are an authorized minister who wants to move to another association or conference, and information for preparing a ministerial profile. But I'm guessing that most of you are interested in resources for congregations. So we have the process to call a pastor, guide to pastoral searches for congregations, welcoming diversity inventory, which is a really important piece that we often overlook, what the template is for a local church profile. And here we are at our compensation guidelines. And then you'll click that and it'll take you right to where you need to be. But for the moment, we're going to stop this share. We're going to move to a different one that I have all ready to go and take us to, oh my heavens, that's not the one I wanted either. Pardon me. This has not been my best moment here. Let's try one more time. This is the one I want. Okay, now where we need to be. So let's close this up and let's reduce that, and let's bring up what we really want. Fantastic. Are you seeing that? Is it too small for you? Do I need to make it bigger? Bigger?
It's fine. I can see it.
Very
Thank you.
well. All right, so what we're going to do is take a walk through this. If at any point we have a question, we'll stop and address that question. There's several times when we will take a look at clergy compensation guidelines, as I said at the onset of our conversation together. The first and foremost is if you are putting together a call agreement for your pastor, perhaps an incoming pastor, maybe you had a designated pastor that you want to make a settled pastor. In most of the ways, these kinds of conversations around compensation, time off, et cetera, take place at the beginning of one's ministry. However, there are times when we want to take a look at compensation guidelines and see that we're staying current with them. For the last 2 or 3 years, our salary compensation has gone up by 2%. We do that as a cost of living. I will say, though, this past year, when we went 2%, we were very much aware that the cost of living was higher than 2%. However, we're also mindful that there are many churches that are feeling budgetary stretches around anything from the cost of heating to decreased offerings, and therefore to be in a place of cognizance around church budgets, we have maintained a 2% increase at the beginning of the year. So let's take a look at this. Whenever we want to talk about conversations around money, we want to talk about how each of us is in a moment of covenant, both the pastor as well as the congregation or council or who is ever putting this together. We want to remain sure that we are having a good relationship at the end, because as we know, money can sometimes make for difficult conversations. We want to make sure that we're being good stewards of the resources that the church has, but we also want to be just, and we want to make sure that the pastors who serve us are able to have a living wage and they are able to care for their families as well. So we look at these guidelines, and of course, this is available to anyone on the Central Atlantic website, so you're able to find that very easily. So there's lots of components to putting together a pastoral compensation package, but we'll start at the very beginning. There is cash salary. Now, the cash salary, we have a grid here that we're going to look at in just a moment, but we're mindful that this grid is based on a full-time model, and therefore, for some of you, that may not be exactly what you need. You might need a part-time model. You might need a per diem where it's per hour. So we'll take a look at some of the conversation we have here, and that is that we are asking that churches try to attempt to hit this as a minimum. You may certainly pay your pastor beyond these recommended guidelines, but we are asking that you try to do your best to reach the minimum. For some folks, that's a possibility, and for other folks, it's more of a challenge. But I encourage you, if you're really in a space where you're not sure if you're going to be able to do that, that we sit down, we take a look at the budget, and we figure out where we might be able to be just in how we give to pastors. So let's take a look at this. If we are talking about this grid and we're saying, well, we'd like to use this grid, but it's based on a solo pastor or a senior pastor, and we have an associate pastor. The recommendation for that is that you take these numbers and that you pay your associate pastor 85% of the numbers that we're going to see. Minister of Christian Education, anyone who is ordained clergy, really should be able to be treated as a professional and therefore compensated in as much as possible in a appropriate realm for the church size, for the person's education, their experience in ministry. If you have an interim, we pay interims the way we pay pastors, because while they will only be with you for a short season, they are doing the same work that your pastor would do. So therefore, we are going to make sure that we pay our interims at the same rate that we pay our regular pastors. Now, there might be a time when you have someone in to cover a sabbatical, and in that case, we want to come back and reflect carefully about how we pay. You're probably not going to pay some of those extra benefits to that sabbatical pastor. So if you have questions about compensation for a special situation like sabbatical coverage, feel free to call your ACM or the conference minister, and we can have conversation around that. There's also a little bit here to talk about supply pastors. So often I have churches say, what is the going rate for supply? And we cover a pretty broad section, this conference does. We'll be anywhere from Washington, D.C. to the very tippy top of Blacksburg, Virginia, where we have Virginia Tech, to all the way up to New Jersey. So whether you are in a small little holler church in the Shenandoah Valley, or you're in a bustling suburb of New Jersey, we are suggesting that pulpit supply ministers receive a minimum of $150 plus mileage. And if you are a dual worship church, meaning you have service at 8 a.m., maybe at 10:30, and you know that you're going to have more than one service, then you should consider increasing your honorarium to $200 plus mileage. So let's take a look at this minimum salary grid. If we are Christ the Redeemer, UCC, who has a modest number of like 150 people, that's where we are, we're on this line, and they decide to hire somebody who's got about 6 years experience, we're going to move to this area right here, and that's what we're going to look at. And that's going to be the number that we're going to try to shoot for. Now, if we said we're going to hire somebody who has more than 20 years experience, you'll notice that we're going to add 1% for each additional year's service. So therefore, if they have 25 years service, we're going to do an extra 5% above 58,967. So this is, you can see, it's pretty self-explanatory. I don't think, and I apologize if I'm misinformed, I don't think we have any church that's more than 950 members. But if we did, you can see that that we make sure that we cover all the way from the smallest church to a much larger church. Now, what if your pastor is part-time? If you have a part-time pastor, you should take a look at this salary grid. And let's say you have a half-time call. Then if we were going to go back to where we were, where we said, oh, we have 150 people, and we're hiring somebody who's been in ministry for 6 years, ordained ministry for 6 years. Now, we're not going to pay a full-time pay, but we have a half-time call, so we're going to divide this number in half. And that will let us know how much our cash salary basis is. And I do believe what we did, we took an example of 200 members, and we talked about the recommended cash salary being divided in half and what that would be. Now, of course, it's not, if your church is not 200 members, you'll need to go to the place on the grid that is applies to you. Now, you could also have a part-time pastor be compensated at an hourly rate, depending on the numbers. Let's say you have a pastor who does visitation for you, and you want to pay them hourly for visitation. So whether you're going to do a part-time, full-time equivalent or an hourly rate, what you want to do is go back to this grid and let this grid guide you about how you want to compensate at that hourly rate or even at a monthly or weekly rate. And it says a clergy employed for more than 24 hours a week should receive housing or housing allowance and benefits. So if you've got a 3/4 time call, then you're definitely going to be looking at housing. So let's turn our eye to housing. So the pastor owns a home, rents a home, the church pays a housing allowance based on local market conditions. I know for most of us, we go by 30% because that is kind of the rule of thumb we've been working with. However, the housing markets in certain places of our conference can vary widely. So if we're in DC, that's not going to be the same as if we're in a small part of Western Maryland, or if we are in a place on the Chesapeake. So we want to be mindful of what are our housing markets? What do we need to look for? And so therefore, we're mindful that we need to not just automatically go to 30%, but think about the local region and how much the market is for whatever size home that you would be looking at. And I usually say to folks, if you have if you have a pastor who perhaps has children grown up and gone, I always look, what's the least you would be paying for an apartment or for a house, and then figure out what the rent of that would be. And that's going to help us get a good idea of what we should be thinking about with a housing allowance. All right, now they have a couple notes here. The congregation benefits from the equity that's built up in the parsonage. If you have a parsonage, they're kind of rare and are around the conference, but there are a few around. And ministers living in parsonages are not able to build up home equity. and will, at the end of their time, sometimes find it hard to purchase a home. So therefore, the church is encouraged to contribute to a parsonage equity plan for the minister, which can be used at the time of his or her retirement. Now, there's a couple of resources in here about how you can determine your local market housing. That'll be at the very back of the document. There's also some procedures for the qualifying housing-related income as tax-free. So let's talk about this for a moment. When I was a quarter-time pastor for a very small rural church, I only made $10,000 a year. When I made $10,000 a year, I would take half of that as my housing allowance. I would designate half of that to be my housing allowance. Why? Because when you designate a housing allowance, that means that the government is going to treat the housing allowance portion of money that you've designated as tax-free. And therefore, you are going to need to substantiate that every dollar you are given as a housing allowance, you can verify that you have been able to spend on your housing. So whether it's going to be your mortgage payment, furnishing, the cleaning, the heavens to Betsy, why can't I say that? Your utilities, my goodness. You have to be able to verify every dollar that you have designated as a housing allowance. So while it would be tempting to designate a great portion of your salary for housing allowance, you have to make sure that you could own that with the IRS. Churches say to me all the time, do we have to tell them how much their housing allowance is? And I said, no, but my goodness, they're going to want to make sure that whatever they say that they're going to do within reason, they can verify with the IRS, because you don't want to get audited and then find out that you have not been able to be realistic about what you receive as tax-free income, because it will not be able to align with what you spend for your mortgage, your furnishings, your cleaning supplies. There's a whole list, and you can find that on irs.gov. But let's continue to look at this. We often every year, and I find most churches don't do this, but you need to be clear at the beginning of the year how much of the salary and housing, whatever that compensation package of salary plus housing is, how much of that is going to be considered housing allowance that gets verified through the IRS or through your taxes. So when I made $10,000, I verified at the beginning of the year, 50% of that was going to go for my housing allowance, and therefore would be told to the IRS. When I was in a full-time call, I did not take half. I took a 30% portion, and that was to be considered as my housing allowance. And that is reported to the IRS. We want to check every year that we're doing that, and we want to make sure that it is reminiscent of the fair market value of the house if it's furnished, fair market rental value of the house if it's furnished, and that it is that, pardon me, I'm losing my mind, and that we can actually be able to verify the cost of repairs, utilities, interest, taxes, furnishings. So we want to, if you are somebody who does not do that every year, then I would encourage the church to create what we call a safety net allowance. And you'll see that has to be a line item budget, a line item on the church's annual budget, so that if the IRS says, well, are you sure you're going to take this? We have a system in place that verifies exactly how much has been designated and how that will work. All right, a parsonage. Some of my churches in the Shenandoah and Catoctin associations have parsonages. If you have a pastor who's going to live in the parsonage, we encourage you to have that parsonage in good working order, to have it attractive and comfortable and well-maintained. It should be spacious enough for adequate sleeping quarters and have a guest room. Appliances should be modern and in good working condition, and all utilities, which is heat, light, water, garbage collection, yard maintenance, basic telephone service, be provided by the church. Now, I'm mindful that for most of us, our sole telephone is often our cell phone. But every once in a while, we have a parsonage that still has a landline. So I want to clarify exactly how what that means. Other expenses of maintaining the home would be excluded from income under IRS regulations, and the parsonage should be really regarded as your pastor's private home, and in that sense, a good boundary around it and clear expectation about when you, as a church member, are allowed to be on that property and inside that home. Should be strict expectations about giving notice to the pastor before coming by, that sort of thing. If you are a clergy and you're living in the parsonage, you're advised to designate a portion of your cash salary as a furnishing allowance to the extent that it's used to pay for all those parsonage-related expenses. This allowance will not be subject to income taxes, and it's normally not more than 10% of your salary. The home equity fund for pastors who live or rent or live in a parsonage, to compensate the loss of home equity to pastors who live in a parsonage or those who rent, the church should establish a home equity fund. It's recommended that $2,000 to $4,000 be placed in the fund each year or held in trust to be given to the pastor when he or she leaves the parish. Now, the pastor might choose another means to receive the home equity funds. Now, so we talked about that 30% or the rental cost of a median home in your rental housing market. Let's take a look at some other benefits that we have besides housing. That's pension, the UCC annuity fund, and it goes through pension boards, is 14% of the base salary. Now, what is a salary base? Salary is cash plus housing allowance and Social Security if you don't have a parsonage. If you do have a parsonage, it's cash and Social Security offset. For the pastor who is, I've already said that. I don't want to be repetitive. Insurance. There is the pension boards, and we're going to look at pension boards in a moment. Pension boards offers the ability to purchase health insurance, vision insurance, dental insurance, disability, long-term and short-term disability, and life insurance. So we will go and move our way through that. And I will say that before we finish, I'll make sure that I pop you over to the pension boards site so that you can see how to go about finding what the rate is for your area. Because when you're trying to put together a call agreement, one of the things that's really challenging is to figure out how much do we need to think about for health insurance. All right, so it is recommended that churches pay 100% of premiums for the most comprehensive medical and dental insurance offered by the UCC program for pastors and their families. And just a note, vision insurance is $100 a year. It's worth it for those of us who wear glasses and know what it costs to have glasses. Vision insurance makes a big deal to be able to knock down that number of how much we pay. Life insurance and disability, we want to make sure we have that. We're going to plan for 1.5% of the cash salary and housing allowance when we figure that out. Your church should have professional malpractice insurance. That usually works through the insurance board. And sometimes your own, if you don't have UCC insurance, your Brothers Mutual, whatever you have, you just want to make sure, do you have a malpractice insurance line that's built into that? It is recommended that all churches provide tenants insurance for pastors who live in a parsonage. All right, we have vacation, other leave. We have vacation. We have sick leave. And of course, vacation, we want to do 4 weeks and 8 days a month should be regarded as personal time for purpose of rest and renewal. We have sick leave. We have family medical leave, parental leave, continuing education. Now, with family medical leave, there's nothing that necessarily you need to build into that. There's no time limit, but you have to be mindful that you're going to have to make every effort to comply with the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993. I understand that that can be difficult because that means your pastor may end up having to take time away from your church. And that means you have to find supply, that sort of thing. And that can be costly. But we also want to remember that, as we said in the beginning, we're covenantal, we're working together, and we want to be a supportive for our pastor, and we want our pastor to be able to be in a good space and healthy as they serve us. So I often have churches say to me, do we really need to put sick leave in there? I say yes, and I'll tell you why, because when when there's a debilitating situation, we want to be able to know how long our time has elapsed before short and long-term disability are going to kick in. So that's why I encourage that. We also want to make sure that um, parents are taking parental leave when they adopt a child or have a baby. And I realize that we do not just look at this as maternal leave anymore, that maternity leave, it is also for the father to be able to be supportive to his spouse, as well as the and I know for myself, my son and his wife took turns. She took her maternity leave first, then he took his parental leave, and together they were able to have their baby in their home a little bit longer, and before they ended up putting it into daycare where they end up exposed. So if we can get a little more time, that's a good thing to do. That's a wonderful thing. Continuing ed, we want to have at least 2 weeks for continuing ed and an annual allowance of $1,200 for continuing education. Not every pastor is going to take those 2 weeks. Sometimes that, be maybe 1 week for a festival of homiletics, or to go and attend something like Mennonite Peace Center's Lombard Center for conflict resolution is a 1 week class. So there's all different ways in which you might be able to do that, but you also might be taking a 2-day retreat. You might be going here or there. So we want to leave adequate leave for that to happen. Sabbaticals. If you have written into your call agreement that your pastor is going to have a sabbatical, we want to plan ahead for that. So not only do we want to make sure that we are providing that leave every 5 years with full pay, with the contingency that the pastor will stay on and serve a year after their sabbatical leave, we also want the churches to plan for those resources necessary to provide continuing ministerial coverage during a pastoral sabbatical. So that means not only do we have our regular budget with our projected costs for our pastor, we want to make a little nest egg over on this side so that we have enough money to cover our ministerial coverage while the pastor is away. And sometimes churches get really what's the word I'm looking at? Churches get really can why can't I think? Creative. And they will find that time to be able to utilize their own lay worship. They'll reach out to communities and have community groups coming in, so that it might not need to be as significant of a nest egg as they were thinking it would be. Social Security offset, really important stuff. The rate for Social Security is 15.3%. Normally, you would pay your employer pays half, you pay half. Now, pastors are independent contractors, so the church pays half of this Social Security offset to the pastor, who then pays that into the federal government. So that means the church's half as employer is 7.65. Now, one thing to note is that they did raise the income ceiling to 168,600. So you don't pay taxes on earnings above that amount. So it's just not that most of us as pastors will ever get paid 168,000 for our work, but just so you know. Professional expenses. Let's talk about those for a little bit. We have automobile, which is our mileage, books and periodicals, and you'll note that as of the IRS usually doesn't release how much that businesses are to be reimbursing cents per mile until January. So although I do this in November, it actually doesn't take full effect until we can get our updated numbers, and that's 67 cents per mile. We also talk about books and periodicals. We ask you to think about $300 annually for that. Conference or association expenses, if you are going to be attending the Central Atlantic Conference annual meeting, well, you need to have some money around that to be able to stay in hotels if it's not close by, or to and to pay the fees that we have that are really associated for us to be able to take care of having an online presence, having food and things like that for you. We also want to talk about background checks. A background check is cost about $180 in this moment. It used to be $160, but I think it might have bumped to $180. And we do that through document. We do that through, why can't I remember the name of it? But it comes through our profile system. So we often ask that since you need to have a background check that is up to date, we ask that the congregation reimburse that when it is hiring a pastor on for the first time. Now, if the pastor's been there for 5 years and they decide to updo their background check, unless you are requiring that through your insurance, you are not responsible for having to reimburse it. Communities of practice. Communities of practice are offered through the conference. They are a peer group that's facilitated by a community practice facilitator who's been trained in that work. It's a monthly, and it happens for 10 months out of the year. It costs $250, which really roughly comes down to $25 a month. It is really a wonderful tool to help to connect pastors to their peers, to create a safe space for them to be able to talk through situations and kind of figure out how they might be able to walk through, like, what do you do when you want to start up a new Christian ed around XYZ, and you get to glean the space in the room, but also you get personal support, and you have somebody that you know you can talk to about things that are either vocational or personal. It's a wonderful thing, and it's a real message that that your church really wants to encourage your pastor to not be siloed, but to be connected and have a web of support. There's other professional expenses that you might have as part of your church. It all depends on what you do. Some pastors will have an expense account for them to be able to spend time with parishioners, like having a cup of coffee or lunch. If that person feels that that would be a good way to create some space for connection and discussion that they might not feel comfortable having at the church. Sometimes there'll be a reimbursement plan. A reimbursement plan can be for for anything from, I'm trying to look and to see. It says the reimbursement plans can be for your professional expenses, but you can also set up like a flexible spending account so that if a person needs to use money for something that's not usually covered by health insurance or dental plans, they can be part of that. The UCC also does a flexible spending account, but you have to get in on that in November to get ready for the new year. So I encourage you to think really carefully about if you want to do this, about how to get connected with that. You need to decide how much you're going to set aside. It needs to be paid according to the submission of expenses, and unused money remains in the church's account. If the money is being set aside from the minister's salary, it's advisable that the estimate at the beginning of the year be low to minimize the risk of having money left unused at the end of the year. All right, let's talk about smaller churches. Churches that have an annual church budget of $195,000 per year and have fewer than 200 members, it may not be possible for them to be able to meet the guidelines. If that's the case, we recommend that the pastor's salary reflect the complexity of the workload. And what do other people in the church do? Is it a large physical plant? What are the church's total resources, endowments, special funds, and that sort of thing? I know a lot of times churches are very careful about not wanting to draw on their endowments, and that leads to them looking very conservatively at their budget, which is a beautiful thing, but sometimes ends up costing you around the people nature of your work and how much you compensate your pastor. So I encourage folks who are in that situation to think broadly about all of their resources as we look about paying the salary. All right, annual church budgets of less than 120,000 per year. So that would be like my little church that I served in the very beginning when I was taking 50% as my housing allowance. Churches that have small congregations and annual budgets less than 120,000 a year really are in a tough spot. It's going to be very hard for them to meet that minimum salary wage. So we're encouraged to find ways to allow for clergy coverage of the congregation, but still have a good salary or benefit. We can talk about that. I encourage you to reach out to your ACM to think about how you can do that creatively. A lot of our pastors are bivocational, and we want to make sure that if they're bivocational, are they getting health insurance somewhere? Remember, at the very beginning, we said we want to talk about covenant and we want to talk about relationship, but we also want to talk about justice. So we want to make sure that whatever we're doing, we are providing a just salary and we are looking after the health care of our pastors. If you are a very, very small church with a part-time pastor, you can take a look at your grid. They have an example of a church that has 60 members and a total budget of $41,000, which is not a lot in a budget. And we can take that and we can use the grid to determine how closely that compensation would meet the conference's guideline. We're probably going to look to either an hourly salary or we're going to think really carefully about what kind of workload that pastor would have, and we'll move from there. I want to encourage everyone to have a pastoral relations committee. The pastoral relations committee should not be chosen by the church, but it should be chosen by the pastor. It should have a good diversity of people on it. And this is a group that the pastor can come to and talk through things. It's also a group that if folks have an issue, they can come to that group. But we don't want to ever come to the pastor and say, some people are saying, because that's just code for one person was saying. So pastor relations committees have great value. They just need to be careful in how they approach their work. And if you have questions about that, I have an entire training on that. So we can talk about that another time. All right, if you are in the search committee, I want to encourage you to think really carefully about how we're going to set about doing that call agreement, providing that equitable play, trying to budget and balance the discrepancy between money and how much money we have, thinking about all different kinds of things. This is a time for you to think very carefully about the wholeness of your pastor and how you want to show up for them. Now, there is a handy dandy package worksheet here. So if you are somebody who wants to kind of pull this out, I always encourage, I will pull this, oftentimes print just this sheet, and I'll use it as a worksheet to be able to work up for what that total pastoral package will look like. So if we have, I guess, give me 1 second. For example, I pulled out that number, that cash salary from if you are less than 200 people in your church, more than one, but less than two, and if you have 5 years experience. Your compensation grid said the cash salary would be $51,597. Now, They didn't have a parsonage. I'm working this up as an example. So there was no parsonage. But then when we got to housing allowance, I did a median. What I looked at was how much would it cost to have an apartment in the city in which this person's call agreement would be placed, this church would be based. And I based it on Frederick. And if you were in Frederick and you had an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment, let's say in Hagerstown, you'd probably be paying somewhere around $1,800 a month. And I did the math to figure that out, and that came up to about $21,000. And therefore, 30%, if we were looking at that 51,597, would have been a little over $15,000, probably would have been $16,000. Now let's think about the difference between 16,000 and 21. So you see how that 30% is a nice number, but it doesn't always take us to where we need to be to have a just living wage. So you would write down your cash salary, you'd write down your housing allowance, then we'd add those numbers together because we want to have 7.65 total of cash salary and either furnishings or housing allowance. We write that number in here. Then we want to do 14% for pension of cash salary or housing allowance and the offset all together. If I was doing my math here based on that 51,597, and I took that $21,000 number, we did our Social Security offset goes in, our pension would end up being $8,393.22. I got real specific on here. I was trying to decide whether I should put cents in there or not. And then the total package would be $89,773.39. So that would be that part of it. And then we want to move down to medical and dental, family protection plan, which maybe you have that. Most folks just have medical and dental and vision if they add vision, disability and life insurance, which is 1.5%, your workers' compensation. That oftentimes gets covered by the church for all employees of the church, but it all depends on how big or small your church is. And then, of course, all those professional expenses that we were talking about, the continuing ed, the sabbatical, the mileage reimbursement, any kind of conference expenses, that sort of thing. So I'm going to take a second here and I'm going to stop sharing this because I want to show you how we can. One second to fix something here. All right, now what we're going to do is take a look at how would we, if we were in the pension, how do we know how much we're going to end up having to pay for health insurance as a church? So what I've done is I've gone to pension boards, which is pbucc.org, and I'm going to go to their homepage. All right, you're in the homepage. So I want to know, how am I going to find out about how much I'm going to pay? See rate locator on the left-hand side? We're going to click that. That's going to take us here. There are 3 different plans with the United Church of Christ and the pension boards. Plan A is what they call their premium plan. You have very little deductible. Plan B, you have a moderate deductible. Plan C, you have a higher deductible. And Plan A costs more than Plan B, which costs more than Plan C. So you want to keep coming down here and use the see as rates shown or approximate. Let's say today is 2024 and we are in Central Atlanta Conference. And let's do 21228 because that is the conference office's zip code. And there's a good chance our pastor's not going to be under 25. So let's look at 41 plus. And now we'll get rates. You see how it brings it up here? So we have Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C, and these are our monthly rates. If you are single, you can expect that you're going to pay for a $1,322 amount for the health insurance of your pastor. And then you see it goes to adults, single with children, to adults with children, that sort of thing. You also can see that there is a dental plan, and it delineates out how much it costs for dental plan. Vision plans are here. Now, maybe your pastor is bivocational and they already have a health plan, but they don't have dental or they don't have vision. They broke this down here and said, look, if you needed standalone dental without health insurance, this is what you would be paying. And everything is monthly, as we said, except for vision, you pay that annually, one time. And I didn't realize it went up $10. It's $110. Still cheaper because my bifocals cost a heck of a lot of money. So I still say you save quite a bit of money. So I wanted to make sure you knew exactly where to find that rate locator. And again, that's on pensionboards.com. So we'll stop sharing that. And we'll move back over to where we were. All right. Now we are at our appendices, and our appendices can give us some different information. We want to know what's the estimate of the minimum requested salary and benefits package. So part-time pastor, very small church, 5 years of experience with a housing allowance. That's if you have less than 60 people in church. The cash salary, $11,000. Now that's quarter time. That's 12 hours a week. Housing allowance, Social Security offset, health insurance, you're basically paying a quarter of the cost of that. Pension, professional reimbursement, and total cost. If your budget is 42.5, that would be a little over half of your budget. That's not uncommon for a small church. Most of the cost either is physical plant or it is pastor's salary, and oftentimes they're pretty close together. All right, and it just goes into a little bit of detail about that based on the grid and how this all would look. And you can get an idea about the housing costs. We already covered that. So let's move into appendix number 2. Oh, I see that apparently I made a mistake of doing a repetitive RES. I'll fix that. I didn't realize that was there. I'll fix that. So resources to assist in deriving the local market housing information. You can look at zilpie.com. You can look at RentBits, Zillow.com. You can go to the Census Bureau. I mean, as we know that housing has gone significantly higher in the last few years. So it might be worth it to look at a couple different options to see. And we have some other resources like completing the circle, reviewing ministries in the congregation, getting to yes, negotiating agreement without giving in, money management for ministers, housing for clergy, which is a New York Times article, tax planning for clergy. And then, of course, I can get you information on Pastoral Relations Committee, but we also have things through United Church Resources. We talked about the pension boards, and there's the website for that. We have Stewardship and Church Finances Ministry, and that's under ucc.com. And then this is Pilgrim Press if you wanted to purchase anything from United Church Resources. The Alban Institute's in here as well because they were part of some piece that came in the creation of this document. Federal income tax information's at irs.gov. That's where I find what is the most recent offset as well as mileage, but that usually gets set every year. And your Social Security tax data and tax information. And we are at the end of that. Is there any questions to lift up and to consider?
Yes, I have a question about the version of the guidelines because I downloaded the guidelines from the December 14th, I think, News Digest, and that those guidelines were dated November 2023. And I saw that the version that you were showing is January 2024.
Yes.
So the
So let's talk
difference,
about that.
yeah, okay,
So the difference is I updated the mileage in January when the IRS released the new mileage. That's when we updated that mileage piece. And that's why
yeah,
we wanted to make sure that though you'll notice in the documents, some it says 11 and some of them it says 1. The only piece that really got updated was the mileage for IRS mileage in January. And I looked
okay,
at that earlier this week. Just it occurred to me I should have checked it right after New Year's. And because I know it only comes up in January, but when I looked in that, I was like, oh, we really need to get that updated. So because it did jump, it was 65 cents before, and now it's 67 cents.
okay. But I saw another difference
Go ahead.
because in the version that you have, the salary increase is 2%. But in the November 2023 version, I saw 3%.
But
So
he,
which,
but I did go and change that because that was an oversight. We initially, as you noted when I was speaking earlier, we were very mindful that the cost of living is getting higher and higher. And we initially went 3%. And then we reflected on it carefully before releasing it. If you do the numbers from last year to this year, you'll find they are 2%. And
okay,
I did change that that line. A very eagle-eyed person caught that and said to me, Teresa, everywhere it says 2 except that one line where it says 3. And I said, oh, I can't believe the 15 times I edited that I didn't see it.
yeah,
So we have
okay,
made that change as well. But it is
all right.
2%. I
It is
encourage, if
2%.
you
Okay,
have the ability to go higher, but most
yeah,
churches don't have that ability. But, and I
okay,
do know pastors say to me, that 2% is not cost of living. I think cost of living it's over 3. Because when I
okay,
was looking at this, it was over 3. We we walk a line to be just with churches and just with pastors. And I find too that oftentimes churches set that call agreement out in the very beginning, but they don't ever relook at it every single year. And oftentimes, if churches give an increase in salary, I don't know that they always reflect on the 2% piece. Sometimes it's a little less. When I served a very, very small church, they came to me and said, we can't really give you a salary increase. Is there some other way that we can compensate you to show, our gratitude for you and to acknowledge? And so, I certainly don't encourage churches to not update their salary requirements of the salary basis for their churches or for their pastors. But if you know you can't do that, what else can you do? Can you give a couple of extra days off? Can you give a Sunday off? How might you be able to find a way to show your gratitude and acknowledge if you can't hit above that 2%?
okay, all right. I have no more questions, but so
Okay.
thank you for that clarification.
You're eagle-eyed because I did not know. I knew about that I changed the mileage earlier in the week because I knew, oh, I haven't done that yet. And I always change it in January. But I didn't pick up on that lone 3 that was snuck in the middle there. I think it's on page 4, I found it.
Yeah,
And I was very fortunate that somebody called me and said, "Do you know on page 4?" And I said, "Let me fix it. Let me fix it." So you'll see the updated one on our website. Well, it's already
yeah,
updated on the website right now for the uh, for the mileage, but I will be updating that paragraph, page 4, middle of the paragraph where that 3 is and fix that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Hold me to it. Hold my feet to the fire. It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Okay. All
Thank
right.
you so much. Thank all of you who might be looking at this from the comfort of your homes down the line beyond this day. We want to honor all the ways that you care for your pastor financially and spiritually. And we also want to honor all the ways your pastor cares for you financially and spiritually. And the better we can acknowledge the care we give one another and do that carefully and intentionally, the better off we are. So thank you all. I really appreciate it. Have a
Okay.
great evening.
So will you be sending this out?
What I'll probably do is I'll have this converted and put onto the website, and then we'll put something
Okay.
on the on the happenings. Yes, I had to think for a minute on happenings to tell folks where to find it.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.